How does the FAA catch US drone pilots when they're in breach of regulations? And when they do, what kind of punishments are they handing out? We're all aware that the FAA doesn't have a police force as such, standing on every street corner and watching every park to see every drone flight. So what do they actually focus on? Today, we're going to be looking at an article put together by a specialist drone lawyer who has looked at 70 cases where the FAA has prosecuted to see whether or not we can take any information from it. Some of the results are certainly what you would probably expect, but some of them are actually quite surprising. That's coming up today on Geeksvana. So here we have the article in question, which is actually on the drone law and drone attorney assistance, which is provided by Ruprecht Law. I know, Jonathan, I'm going to be absolutely butchering your surname, so I do apologize for that. There's a link in the description to this full article, which again, as I say, some of the information here is actually pretty interesting. The article starts off by discussing the fact that this is a civil administrative law rather than criminal law. So they are focusing specifically on the civil penalties and certificate actions, since they are the two most common types of enforcement action taken against remote pilots. So first up, and we look at obviously the male-female mix here as far as the 70 cases which were actually prosecuted. And as Jonathan notes on the comments there, yeah, we all figured this. So 57 out of the 70 were male, 2 were female, 11 redacted. This next part of the article is very interesting, so it talks about how much you can actually get fined for flying a drone illegally. So as it states here, the exact dollar value of the proposed civil penalty fine varies significantly depending on the severity of your violation or violations and the extent of your illegal drone flying. It's important to note that the difference between proposed penalties and settled penalties, and that is a very big thing to remember there. If the FAA chooses to pursue an enforcement case against you and has selected a civil penalty as the sanction, you will receive a notification of proposed civil penalty, outlining your specific violations and the dollar value of the proposed civil penalty. Sometimes an aviation or UAS attorney is able to reduce that amount of a proposed penalty, reaching an agreement with the FAA prosecutor for a fine that is less than the amount initially proposed. So that is obviously the settled penalty. So for instance, you may get a letter through your door saying you have breached X, Y, and Z, so we are proposing to fine you $20,000. Through negotiation with your lawyer, you may find that gets reduced down, be that through the number of charges that actually are successfully put against you in the settled form, or the actual dollar amount of each of the fines. And then this table below actually shows you the proposed fines over time. And as you can see there, as many of us are aware of, the highest fine ever was the Skypan case of 1.9 million. And then you can see that things are certainly around below the $20,000 mark, very many of them down below the $10,000 mark there, which is interesting. Next up, it looks at the top 10 proposed fines. And again, here we can see obviously the Skypan one there is number one. Number two, $182,004. I wonder who that could possibly be. And then it tapers off very, very quickly from there. Interestingly, of course, the 182,000 one is one of the most recent ones. So that's something to keep in mind there. This next table is something which I find quite interesting in particular. We have obviously the amounts here, the sort of the proposed fines over time, and then the top 10 proposed fines. But this chart here actually shows you the number of violations charged. It's very interesting here that over time it is multiple charges, quite often going over the sort of 6 to 8 level of charges, sometimes even peaking there at over 12 charges, although they are still fairly rare. But certainly, as you can see from this chart, the number of charges is increasing as time goes by. Now, has the FAA revoked or suspended a drone pilot certificate? Yes, the FAA has brought certificate action enforcement cases against drone pilots. Of the 70 UAS enforcement action cases that Jonathan analysed, 5 of them resulted in a form of certificate action. So 2 cases resulted in the revocation of a certificate, 2 cases resulted in certificate suspension, which was 170-day and 120-day periods, and 1 case resulted resulted in certificate revocation and a $3,000 civil penalty. The next one I wanted to show you was actually looking at which areas are most active. So this is a count of enforcement division. As you can see there, the Northeast team of these 70 were by far the most active, with the Great Lakes team, as you might expect, and the Office of Regional Counsel for Fort Worth, Texas, being there at the bottom for obvious reasons. But very interesting that the Northwest team is so far out ahead. Next up, we look at what are the most common drone regulatory violations. Upon analysing the 70 enforcement action cases, several items stood out, particularly the most common regulatory violations. Most frequently violated FARs by remote pilots. You don't have a remote pilot certificate. Second was careless or reckless. The third is acting as an RPIC without a certificate. Fourth was careless and reckless as well on a different article. Drone not registered. Aeronautical knowledge not current, failed to pre-flight, posed undue hazard, and RPIC failed to ensure compliance with regulations. And then obviously, as the one you would expect, operated in airspace without authorization. How does that table as far as the most common drone regulatory violations strike you? Be interested to know. Let me know in the comments below. Now, here is one of the parts of the article which really does get to the meat of the data. Where is the FAA really active in prosecuting illegal drone flyers? The FAA is most active in pursuing enforcement actions against remote pilots when the violations involve breaching airspace without proper authorization. Makes sense, doesn't it? Flying directly over people and loss of control incidents. So, airspace, there are two primary types of airspace violations the FAA tends to prosecute. So this is the ones that actually get through to the stage of being prosecuted. Standard Class B, C, D, and E violations as specified in 107.41, and special use airspace violations as specified in 107.45 and 107.47. If you're a manned aircraft pilot, when you hear the term special use airspace, you're likely thinking of restricted, prohibited, and warning areas. Whilst 107.45 does ban CUAS operations in prohibited and restricted areas, 107.47 is the far more frequently violated FAR. Examples of such violations include flying inside the Washington, D.C. SFRA and FRZ, flying inside a TFR issued for an athletic event, or flying inside a presidential TFR. Interesting. Okay, next up is flying over people. This violation, of course, is more common than you might think. 107.39 prohibits anyone from operating a CUAS over human beings unless that person is participating in the operation of the CUAS or located under a structure or car of some type. Frequently, when a remote pilot flies over a festival, gathering, or athletic event of some type, they're violating 107.39. There is an exemption, however, where a remote pilot may request a waiver to fly over people. Interestingly, Jonathan notes in this article that being said, none of the violators in the cases that they analysed had obtained such a waiver. Of the 70 cases we analysed, 20 of them included violations of 107.39. For example, in one case, an operator flew directly over a baseball stadium filled with 12,000 people. The proposed and settled civil penalty in that case was $2,200. And next up on the list of areas where the FAA are actually prosecuting people is loss of control. When a remote pilot loses control of a CUAS whilst in flight, the FAA considers this to be a severe problem and a violation of 107.23, which prohibits any person from operating a CUAS in a careless or reckless manner. Very much like the UK, this gives quite a lot of latitude for authorities as far as being able to interpret what is careless and reckless. In the UK, we have Article 241, amongst others, which are fairly generic in how they're able to be implemented in terms of the type of drone flight. But certainly, loss of control is one which is very serious. When the loss of control incident causes injury, harm to persons or property, the proposed civil penalty is likely to be far higher than if the CUAS simply crashed into a field. For example, consider one of the cases that they analysed. The operator flew in Class D airspace without authorization from air traffic control over a bridge for commercial purposes whilst taking aerial videography of the bridge and the city. The operator lost control of the CUAS and it crashed into the bridge, damaging property. Excluding the additional violations, the FAA held that the operator violated 107.23a. The proposed civil penalty was $13,251. However, the settled penalty, the amount actually paid to the FAA, was $1,325. That's a 11,900 or thereabouts reduction, which is incredible, really, isn't it? And the last one, as far as where they're actually taking action at the moment, is stadiums. Stadiums typically have TFRs, and the FAA nailed many who were flying in the TFRs near the stadiums. So next up, let's look at actually how the FAA are finding out about these issues. Some of the drones crashed into things, the AT&T Stadium, each other, and the hotel property down below, etc. This allowed other people to physically obtain the drone, and of course it's hopefully going to have a registration mark, etc., and be traceable, certainly as well through things like serial numbers. So at the end of the article here, Jonathan gives some important information in terms of what lessons can be learned from that, which includes ensuring that you are hiring drone pilots in the correct way to ensure that their certification is current, that type of thing. He offers ways, if you contact him, of being able to put systems in place to protect your business from that. And obviously talking about the fact that intentional beyond visual line of sight is a violation. The Philadelphia flyer guy was fined for intentionally flying his drone beyond radio line of sight, which the FAA held to be a violation. I think overall there we have some very interesting information about how the FAA is actually finding out about drone flight issues, illegal drone flights, and what type of things that they are focused on in terms of actually issuing fines. Now, it's also interesting, isn't it, when you look at the difference between proposed fine and fine paid, there always seems to be quite a bit of negotiation there. Let me know in the comments below what this information tells you as US drone flyers. I'd be really interested to hear, particularly from the hobbyist drone flyers as well, and also the Part 107 flyers, to see what your thoughts are on the types of violation and how the FAA is actually going about finding out about these kind of things. If you're new here, please do hit the subscribe button. If you're still watching the video now, thank you very much for doing that, but also please hit the like button as well. Sean out.